Elon Musk walked into the studio knowing exactly what was about to happen. The stage was set, the cameras were rolling, and across from him sat a host who had built his career tearing down guests who didn't align with the mainstream narrative. This was supposed to be an ambush, a carefully orchestrated takedown designed to corner Musk, to make him stumble, to paint him as reckless, irresponsible, dangerous. The questions would be framed as neutral but laced with accusation. The audience had been selected to react at just the right moments. The production team was ready to clip and edit whatever soundbite they needed to control the post-show narrative. But there was one problem. Musk wasn't here to play their game. He had no notes, no rehearsed talking points, no team whispering advice into his ear, just an unshakable confidence and a quiet amusement at what was about to unfold. They thought they were going to expose him. They had no idea that by the end of this interview, they would be the ones exposed. Before we continue this story, let us know where you're watching from, and if you enjoy heartfelt stories like this, make sure to subscribe to the channel. We'd love to hear your thoughts on this story, so after watching, leave a comment below and tell us what you think. And don't forget, tomorrow, we have another inspiring story just for you. The lights in the studio burned bright, casting sharp reflections on the polished table between them. The air carried a strange tension, the kind that wasn't immediately obvious, but made the atmosphere feel heavier, almost electric. The host leaned forward, his practiced smile fixed in place, his carefully constructed demeanor exuding a mix of feigned curiosity and subtle hostility. This was his arena, and he had played this game countless times before. The man sitting across from him, however, was not an ordinary guest. Elon Musk was relaxed, almost disinterested, drumming his fingers lazily against the surface. His eyes, half-lidded, studied the host with the quiet amusement of someone who had already predicted every move before the first question was even asked. "Mr. Musk," the host began, his voice smooth, carefully controlled. "You've been called a genius, a visionary, a disruptor. Some would say even a necessary force of change. But others argue that with great power comes great irresponsibility." He let the words hang in the air for a moment before adding, "Would you say that's fair?" A question designed to appear neutral but laced with an underlying accusation. The classic opening move, set the guest on edge without making the hostility explicit. Musk smirked, shifting slightly in his seat. "Depends," he said simply, his voice calm. "Irresponsible compared to what?" The host didn't miss a beat, already prepared for this. "Well, let's talk about Twitter. Or should I say, X. When you took over, you fired thousands of employees, dismantled moderation policies, and, according to critics, turned what was once a reliable platform into a breeding ground for misinformation and hate speech. Isn't that the definition of reckless?" He leaned in just a little more, a glint of anticipation in his eyes. Musk tilted his head slightly, considering. "Interesting perspective," he said, drawing out the pause just long enough to make the room feel tighter. "Let me ask you something. Before I bought Twitter, when the platform was suppressing certain stories, banning accounts for questioning mainstream narratives, and making decisions behind closed doors, was that responsible?" The host's smile flickered for just a second, barely noticeable but caught by the cameras. He quickly regained his composure. "The previous team was following policies designed to protect users from harmful content," he countered smoothly. "What you've done is remove safeguards in the name of free speech, and now extremist voices have a larger platform than ever before." Musk chuckled softly, shaking his head as if amused by the predictability of the exchange. "Fascinating. So your argument is that controlling the flow of information is acceptable as long as it aligns with the right perspective?" He lifted an eyebrow, watching the host closely. "Who decides what's harmful? You?" The host opened his mouth, but Musk continued before he could answer. "Because, if I recall correctly, many of those so-called safeguards were used to suppress legitimate journalism, inconvenient truths, and even scientific discussions that later turned out to be accurate. But of course, that wasn't reckless, was it?" The audience was silent now, watching intently. Some leaned forward, others exchanged quick glances, sensing that the conversation had already deviated from the usual script. The host adjusted his tie, his fingers gripping the edge of his notes just a little tighter. "So you're saying there should be no moderation at all?" he pressed. That people should be allowed to say whatever they want regardless of the consequences? Musk exhaled sharply through his nose, shaking his head again, this time more firmly. I'm saying that a handful of unelected, unaccountable people shouldn't have the power to decide what billions of people can and can't say. If your ideas are strong, you shouldn't be afraid of debate. The host leaned back slightly, reassessing. This was not how the opening exchange was supposed to go. Musk wasn't scrambling for a defense. He wasn't on the back foot. If anything, he seemed amused, as if he had walked into the studio already knowing exactly how this would play out. The host had prepared his traps, but so far, none of them had worked. The real game was just beginning. The studio was designed for dominance. Every detail, from the strategically placed lighting to the calculated angles of the cameras, served a single purpose: to create an environment where the guest always felt at a disadvantage. The host's chair was positioned slightly higher than the guest's, a subtle psychological trick meant to establish authority. The audience, though mostly passive, had been carefully selected. Not entirely scripted, but certainly not neutral. These were people who had come expecting a spectacle, some already leaning towards the host's perspective, others just eager to witness a takedown. The host himself was a well-known figure in political media, a man who had built his career on aggressive interviews with high-profile guests, particularly those who challenged mainstream narratives. He thrived on controversy, on moments that could be clipped into viral soundbites where he appeared to dismantle his opponent with ease. His supporters saw him as a fearless truth seeker, unafraid to confront the powerful. His critics saw him as a manipulator, someone who thrived not on honest debate, but on carefully orchestrated takedowns, built on selective outrage and calculated framing. His interviews were less about uncovering truth and more about reinforcing a pre-existing narrative, a game he had played so many times that he barely needed to think about his moves anymore. Elon Musk, however, was a different kind of guest. He didn't fit into the usual mold of politicians or corporate figures who came prepared with rehearsed talking points and nervous smiles. He was unpredictable, known for off-the-cuff remarks that could either disarm an opponent or send an entire industry into chaos. He had built companies that reshaped the world: Tesla, SpaceX, Neuralink, The Boring Company, and now X, formerly Twitter. He wasn't just a businessman, he was a cultural force, someone who had gained an almost mythic status in the modern era. To some, he was a visionary, a genius who defied the establishment and pushed humanity forward. To others, he was a reckless billionaire, a man whose wealth and influence made him dangerous. Tonight's interview was meant to reinforce the latter perception. The air in the studio was thick with a silent anticipation. The audience was waiting, the cameras were rolling, and both men at the table knew exactly what kind of moment was being constructed. The host's expression was one of practiced confidence, the kind that came from knowing he had the home field advantage. He had done his research, or at least enough to believe he could control the direction of the conversation. He had his notes in front of him, filled with key points and statistics, pre-prepared rebuttals designed to corner his guest into either defending the indefensible or stumbling into contradiction. His strategy was simple: force Musk into a defensive posture, overwhelm him with a barrage of carefully framed questions, and control the tempo of the discussion before his opponent had the chance to gain ground. But Musk was not playing by those rules. He sat back, relaxed but alert, his expression unreadable. He wasn't fidgeting, wasn't adjusting his tie, wasn't scanning the room nervously the way so many before him had. He had no notes, no pre-written responses, no carefully worded PR statements. He was just there, waiting, as if this was all mildly amusing to him. The cameras caught everything: the faint smirk at the corner of his mouth, the way his fingers tapped absent-mindedly against the table, the slow, deliberate way he blinked as the host spoke, as if weighing each word not for its content, but for the intention behind it. The audience, though silent for now, would be a factor soon. The producers knew when to cue reactions, when to cut to close-ups, when to highlight moments of tension. Everything was about controlling the story, making sure that even before the final edit there was already a clear winner in the public's eyes. The studio's acoustics were designed in such a way that even a small murmur from the audience felt amplified, adding weight to a particularly strong statement or a well-placed jab. The host knew this. He had mastered the art of building momentum in a conversation, of using the audience's energy to shift power dynamics in his favor. But Musk was an anomaly, someone who had never needed an audience's approval to validate his words. If anything, the more someone tried to control the narrative, the more he thrived in dismantling it. The host was expecting a battle of wits, a clash of ideologies, but he had underestimated something fundamental. Musk wasn't there to play defense. He wasn't just going to respond, he was going to deconstruct the very premise of the conversation itself. The stage was set. The questions had begun. The first few exchanges had been delivered with controlled precision, but there was already a shift in the air, a subtle but undeniable change in energy. The host had assumed he was steering the conversation, but for the first time there was a hesitation in his rhythm, a split-second delay between his words, as if he was beginning to realize that his usual strategies weren't landing the way they were supposed to. Musk hadn't even truly engaged yet, and already the balance of power in the room was starting to shift. The host's smile remained fixed, but there was a sharper edge to it now, a subtle shift in tone that signaled the real game was beginning. The introductory pleasantries were over. It was time to start tightening the noose. He leaned forward slightly, his fingers resting on his stack of notes, glancing down as if scanning for the right moment to strike. The cameras adjusted their angles, framing him as the composed interrogator, while Musk remained reclined in his chair, unbothered, as if this entire exchange was nothing more than a minor inconvenience. "You've positioned yourself as a champion of free speech," the host began, his voice measured, deliberate. "But let's be honest, free speech has consequences: hate speech, misinformation, harassment. Ever since you took over X, there's been an undeniable rise in dangerous rhetoric on the platform. People who were once banned for spreading harmful lies have been reinstated. That's not just speech, that's enabling toxicity on a massive scale. At what point does free speech become a threat to democracy?" There it was, a question designed not for an answer but for a reaction, a question Musk couldn't respond to without implicitly conceding ground. If he defended his policies, he would be accused of justifying hate. If he pushed back, it would be framed as evasion. The host watched him carefully, waiting for a sign of discomfort, a flicker of doubt, anything that could be seized upon. But Musk simply raised an eyebrow, as if mildly intrigued by the approach. "Interesting choice of words," Musk said, his voice calm. "You said, a rise in dangerous rhetoric. What exactly do you mean by that? More people expressing opinions you don't like?" The host's smile faltered for the briefest moment before he recovered. "I mean factual misinformation that leads to real-world harm, conspiracies, election denial, medical disinformation. Like the ones that were labeled misinformation before, later turning out to be true?" Musk interrupted, tilting his head slightly. "Or the ones your network pushed because they fit a convenient narrative?" A murmur rippled through the audience. The host ignored it, keeping his eyes locked on Musk. "This isn't about narratives, this is about responsibility. You own a platform that reaches hundreds of millions of people. You don't think you have an obligation to regulate content that could be actively dangerous?" Musk exhaled slowly, shaking his head slightly, as if disappointed by the predictability of the exchange. "The problem," he said, his tone still unshaken, "is who decides what qualifies as dangerous. You? Your producers? The government? The last people who ran Twitter had a similar mindset. They called it content moderation, but what it really was selective censorship. And you had no problem with that." The host's eyes narrowed. "That's a false equivalence. Moderation is about protecting people from harm, not silencing opinions." Musk leaned forward slightly now, mirroring the host's earlier posture. "Protecting people from harm," he repeated slowly, as if testing the phrase. "So when Twitter suppressed the Hunter Biden laptop story before the 2020 election, when it actively worked to bury a legitimate news piece because it was inconvenient, was that protecting people from harm? Or was it protecting certain people from accountability?" The host's jaw tightened. He had expected pushback, but not this early, not this precise. This was supposed to be the part where Musk grew defensive, where he stumbled over justifications while the host controlled the tempo. Instead, Musk was dictating the direction of the conversation. The energy in the room was shifting, Some in the audience exchanged glances, sensing the disruption in the usual flow. The host adjusted his papers, a calculated movement meant to signal control, but Musk caught it. He smirked, just slightly. "You seem uncomfortable," Musk observed, "not used to being on this side of the questions." The host let out a short, forced chuckle. "I'm just making sure we stay on track. The fact remains that your changes at X have led to a more hostile environment. Hate speech reports have skyrocketed. Extremist accounts have been welcomed back. At what point do you take responsibility for what's happening on your platform?" Musk sighed as if this was all terribly exhausting, and yet, engagement is higher than ever. More people are using the platform, having real discussions, debating issues without fear of being shut down by some invisible authority. That's what free speech is. It's not perfect, it's not always polite, but it's necessary. "But at what cost?" the host pressed, leaning in. "You keep saying free speech, but what about the people who suffer because of it? The ones targeted, harassed, doxxed? You talk about freedom, but what about their freedom to exist without being attacked?" Musk's expression didn't change, but there was a shift in his posture. Subtle, but there. He had been waiting for this moment, the inevitable emotional appeal, the attempt to frame the conversation as a battle between cold, detached ideology and human suffering. It was the move the host always relied on when logic wasn't enough to tip the scales. "Let me ask you something," Musk said, his voice level. "If someone criticizes the government, and the government then punishes them for it, who's the real threat? The critic, or the ones trying to silence him?" The host hesitated just for a second. A moment too long. Musk didn't wait for an answer. "The difference between free speech and censorship isn't about protecting people from offense," Musk continued. "It's about who gets to decide what's allowed and what isn't. And historically, when people in power get to control that, it doesn't end well." The silence in the room stretched for a beat longer than comfortable. The host quickly glanced at his producer, a brief flicker of uncertainty in his eyes before he turned back to Musk. He hadn't lost yet, but he could feel it slipping. This was supposed to be the warm-up, the slow build-up to putting Musk in checkmate. Instead, he was the one on the defensive. And Musk wasn't even done yet. The host's demeanor was shifting. He was still composed, still controlling his tone, but the calculated ease he had at the start of the interview was beginning to erode. The rhythm he had relied on, build the pressure, force hesitation, extract a damaging quote, wasn't working. Musk wasn't defensive, wasn't scrambling for a justification. He wasn't even particularly combative. He simply refused to engage with the premise of the questions in the way the host wanted. That alone was enough to disrupt the flow. The host knew he had to regain control before the conversation fully slipped from his grasp. "You keep talking about free speech like it's some absolute ideal," the host said, voice tightening just slightly. "But there are limits even in the freest societies. You can't yell fire in a crowded theater. You can't incite violence. You can't spread dangerous lies that get people killed. And yet, under your leadership, X has become a hub for exactly that. You've allowed people with histories of inciting harm back onto the platform. You've removed policies that once kept disinformation in check. Do you really not see the damage that's causing?" Musk inhaled, slow and deliberate, as if giving the question more weight than it deserved. "So let's clarify something," he said, shifting slightly in his seat. "You say, I've allowed people back onto the platform, as if my role is to sit in some ivory tower and determine which voices are acceptable and which aren't. That's the problem. Before I took over, Twitter wasn't enforcing worldview, it was enforcing a specific worldview. That's not moderation, that's narrative control." The host shook his head. "Come on, that's a lazy argument. There's a difference between keeping a space safe and controlling a narrative." "Safe for whom?" Musk asked, his voice still calm but carrying a sharper edge now. "For the people who agree with you. Because it certainly wasn't safe for the people who didn't. And let's be real, this isn't about safety, it's about control." The same media outlets clutching their pearls over dangerous rhetoric had no problem pushing misinformation when it suited them. Weapons of mass destruction, Russiagate, lockdown policies that later turned out to be completely flawed. They were wrong. repeatedly, catastrophically, but you want me to believe they should still be the ones deciding who gets to speak? The host exhaled sharply through his nose, irritated now. This wasn't how these exchanges were supposed to go. He leaned in, his voice gaining urgency. You keep deflecting by pointing at the past, but I'm talking about now. Right now, as we speak, your platform is fueling extremism. Hate crimes are up. White nationalist groups are more active than ever. Political violence is rising. You can sit here and make this a philosophical debate, but the consequences are real. Do you take any responsibility for that? Musk tilted his head slightly, watching him. And before I took over, none of this existed? He let the question hang for just a moment before continuing. Or was it just easier to ignore because the people being silenced weren't the ones you cared about? A murmur rippled through the audience. The host stiffened, gripping the edge of his notes a little tighter. That's a false narrative, he snapped. You're dodging the real issue. Musk chuckled softly, shaking his head. No, I'm exposing the double standard. Your argument only works if people forget history. Social media platforms were always political. They were just political in a way you approved of. Now that there's actual balance, suddenly it's a crisis. The host could feel control slipping. He had built his career on dominating interviews, on leading the conversation down carefully structured pathways that forced his guests into submission. But Musk wasn't playing along. Worse, he wasn't even flustered. He wasn't raising his voice, wasn't shifting uncomfortably, wasn't displaying any of the usual tells of someone feeling the pressure. He looked, if anything, amused. You act like you're some kind of rebel, the host shot back, his frustration bleeding into his tone now. Like you're fighting against oppression, but you're not some underdog. You're the richest man in the world. You own one of the biggest communication platforms on the planet. You're not dismantling power structures, you are the power structure. Musk gave a small, almost imperceptible nod, as if acknowledging the point. Then he leaned forward, his expression unreadable. Then, why are you so afraid of me? The words landed heavier than the host had expected. His lips parted slightly, but no immediate response came. The air in the studio felt different now. The audience, once passive, was leaning in. The cameras caught everything. The way the host's fingers twitched slightly against the desk. The way his gaze flickered to the producers for just a fraction of a second before he forced himself to focus back on Musk. I'm not afraid of you, the host said finally, though the edge in his voice betrayed him. I'm holding you accountable. Musk nodded again, slowly. And who holds you accountable? The silence that followed was longer than it should have been. The host could feel it slipping now. The control, the authority, the unshakable presence he had always projected in these moments. He needed to regain the upper hand before it was too late. He glanced at his notes, searching for the next attack, the next pivot, the next attempt to push Musk onto the defensive. But Musk was watching him closely, his expression unreadable, waiting, and the host realized, so was everyone else. The silence stretched a second too long. The host felt it, the weight of the pause, the way the energy in the room had shifted. He had been the one leading the charge, pushing the conversation forward, framing the debate in a way that left Musk constantly needing to justify himself. But now, for the first time, the roles had reversed. Musk wasn't answering. He was waiting, watching, letting the question linger in the air like an open challenge. And the host, seasoned, prepared, armed with statistics and pre-scripted counters, realized he had walked straight into something he hadn't anticipated. Musk exhaled lightly, then leaned in, his voice calm but carrying a quiet finality. See, here's the thing, he said. You keep talking about responsibility, about who should control what information people see, but the uncomfortable truth is, for years, it was people like you who had that control. Your network, your allies in media, the so-called experts you platformed. You weren't just reporting news, you were shaping it, deciding which narratives deserved airtime and which needed to be buried. And it worked, until now. The host shifted slightly, a nearly imperceptible movement, but the cameras caught it. That's a conspiracy theory, he said. but the usual certainty in his voice had thinned just enough for Musk to notice. "Is it?" Musk said, tilting his head slightly. "Let's test that." He reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone, casually unlocking it with a swipe. The studio screens behind them remained on the network's branding, but Musk wasn't looking at them. He was looking at something else. Something the producers had not prepared for. "I don't expect you to admit it," Musk continued, eyes still on his screen, fingers tapping quickly. "But your viewers deserve to know what kind of operation you're running here." He turned the phone slightly, as if reading aloud. "Interesting. Here's an email chain from... Oh, what's this? One of your senior producers coordinating with a certain intelligence agency on what stories should be prioritized for public visibility. Wouldn't you call that misinformation management?" The host blinked, but his face remained carefully neutral. His mind, however, was already racing. This wasn't in the script. This wasn't in the prep notes. He had contingencies for when guests dodged questions, when they got defensive, even when they tried to turn the conversation around. But this was something else. Musk wasn't arguing a point anymore. He was presenting evidence. "I don't know where you got that," the host said carefully. But the damage had already begun. The audience had shifted. They weren't just watching a tense debate anymore. They were watching an exposure in real time. "Oh, this?" Musk said, lifting the phone slightly. "Public record now, thanks to a little thing called the Twitter files. You remember those, right? The internal documents showing how major media outlets worked hand in hand with government officials to suppress certain stories. I believe your network dismissed them as baseless speculation at the time. Strange, considering how many of those speculations turned out to be true." The host felt his heartbeat quicken. He could hear the faint murmuring from the audience, a ripple of tension growing between the rows. His producers were likely scrambling behind the scenes, trying to figure out how to steer this back under control. He needed to shut this down. Now! "Musk, I'm not going to entertain a conversation built on leaked documents that have been taken out of context," the host said, regaining some of his footing. "You're making serious allegations without any credible verification." Musk smirked, locking his phone and placing it casually on the table between them. "Without verification?" he echoed. "That's funny, because that's exactly what your network did when it pushed the Steele dossier without evidence, when it declared the Hunter Biden laptop story Russian disinformation without investigating it, when it spent years calling dissenters conspiracy theorists, only to quietly admit later that, whoops, turns out they were right." The host's fingers tightened on his pen. He could feel the momentum slipping, the once solid ground beneath him crumbling. "You're dodging," he tried again. "We're here to talk about X, not to relitigate past media decisions." "No," Musk said flatly. "We're here because you thought you could corner me. But now that the conversation isn't going the way you planned, you want to change the subject." A pause, a crack in the host's mask. He could hear the shift in the room, sense the way the audience was absorbing this in real time. The studio was designed to make guests feel small, to keep the host in control, but right now, the power dynamic had flipped. Musk wasn't on the defensive. He was pressing forward, and the host was the one running out of ground to retreat. The host drew in a breath, straightening his posture. "Let's bring this back to the core issue," he said, grasping for control. "The reality is, under your leadership, X has become a hub for dangerous ideas. You can deflect all you want, but the fact remains, your decisions have emboldened extremists. People have been hurt. People have died." Musk's eyes narrowed slightly, but not in anger. It was something colder, sharper. He leaned forward, elbows on the table, and let a silence stretch just long enough to make the host uncomfortable. "You want to talk about harm?" Musk's voice was quieter now, but somehow more dangerous. "Let's talk about what happens when the media suppresses real information under the guise of protecting democracy. Let's talk about lives ruined because the truth was inconvenient. Let's talk about the people who lost everything because they dared to question the wrong narrative." His gaze was unwavering. "You don't get to play moral authority here, not after everything." The host swallowed. The control he had walked in with, the dominance he had expected, gone. This was no longer an interview, it was something else entirely. And worst of all, he knew the cameras were catching every second of it. The host's posture was rigid now, his fingers gripping the edges of his notes just a little too tightly. He had spent years mastering the art of control, dictating the tempo of interviews, guiding conversations toward pre-scripted conclusions. But now, under the harsh glow of the studio lights, with the cameras capturing every shift in expression, it was clear to everyone in the room he had lost it. The narrative was no longer his to control. The audience wasn't just watching an interview, they were witnessing a dismantling in real time. Musk sat back, exuding a quiet confidence that made the imbalance even more obvious. He wasn't rushing, wasn't scrambling to prove anything. He had already won, and he knew it. The host, on the other hand, was still desperately searching for a way to salvage the moment. He straightened his shoulders, adjusting his tie with a practiced movement, trying to regain the authority he had walked in with, but no amount of posturing could mask the reality of what had just happened. "So, that's it?" the host finally said, forcing a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "You come here, throw around accusations, claim to be some warrior for free speech, and expect people to just believe you?" He exhaled, shaking his head slightly as if disappointed. "You can spin this however you want, but the facts remain. Hate speech on X is higher than ever. Dangerous figures have been reinstated. The platform is more polarized than ever before, and you still refuse to take responsibility." Musk let the words settle before responding, his voice as even as ever. "The world is polarized," he said simply. "You think banning people from social media changes that? All it does is push conversations underground, make people feel unheard, radicalize them even more. You don't fight bad ideas by silencing them, you fight them with better ideas." The host scoffed, but there was a forced quality to it now, a subtle tremor beneath the surface. "That's a nice philosophy," he shot back, "but it doesn't work in practice. You've built a megaphone for extremism and called it balance. People are suffering because of your decisions, and instead of acknowledging it, you're sitting here playing the victim." Musk chuckled, shaking his head. "I'm the victim?" He leaned forward slightly, his gaze locking onto the hosts with quiet intensity. "You're the one sitting here in a studio owned by a corporate conglomerate, backed by billion-dollar advertisers, with a carefully curated audience and an entire production team making sure you always look like the smartest person in the room. And you're calling me the one with the megaphone?" The host opened his mouth, then hesitated. That hesitation was all the cameras needed. The moment stretched just long enough for the weight of it to sink in. Musk didn't need to raise his voice. He didn't need to keep hammering the point. The audience had already seen what they needed to see. Musk sat back again, exhaling slowly, as if this entire conversation had been nothing more than an inevitable sequence of events. "You don't want free speech," he said. "You want controlled speech. Speech that fits within an acceptable framework, dictated by people like you. And the second that control slips, you call it chaos." The host inhaled sharply through his nose, his grip on the desk tightening for just a second before he forced himself to relax. "People are watching this interview right now," he said, his voice carefully measured. "They see what's happening on your platform. They see the hate, the division. If X collapses because of your reckless leadership, if democracy is damaged in the process, what will you say then?" Musk tilted his head slightly, considering the question, then shrugged. "I'd say if democracy is so fragile that people having open conversations can destroy it, then maybe the problem isn't the conversations." Silence. Not just between them, but in the studio. A kind of charged stillness that made the usual hum of whispered exchanges and shifting bodies feel suddenly deafening. The host glanced at his producers for the briefest moment, his lips pressing into a thin line, but there was no rescue coming. This was live. There was no edit, no carefully controlled framing to undo what had just happened. Musk checked his watch, then looked back up at the host. "Are we done here?" His tone was light, almost casual, but the effect was devastating. It wasn't a question, it was a statement. This interview was over, and not because of time constraints or segment breaks, but because there was nothing left to say. The host had lost control, and everyone knew it. The host forced another smile, one that barely concealed the tension in his jaw. "I think we've covered enough," he said, but the words rang hollow. He knew it, Musk knew it, and more importantly, the audience knew it. The camera lights blinked, the teleprompter cues rolled forward, and the production team scrambled to transition into the next segment. But it was too late. The damage was done. The moment had already gone viral before the interview had even ended. The interview had barely ended when the internet erupted. Within minutes, clips of Musk's exchanges flooded X, each one carefully clipped and captioned to emphasize the most devastating moments. The hashtag #MuskDestroysMS shot to the top of trending, followed closely by "Who controls the narrative?" and "Free speech matters." The host's carefully constructed image of an authoritative interrogator was gone, replaced by screenshots of his faltering expressions, side-by-side comparisons of his past statements, and slowed-down replays of the moment he had lost control. Memes appeared instantly. One particularly brutal clip showed the host blinking in silence after Musk's final retort, overlaid with the caption, "When you realize the script isn't working." Another freeze frame of Musk casually checking his watch was paired with, "Elon had places to be, but he gave this man a lesson first." Twitter threads dissected every exchange, with users analyzing how Musk had flipped the traditional media playbook on its head, refusing to accept the host's framing and instead turning the interview into an exposure of the network itself. The media reaction was swift but fractured. Liberal outlets rushed to frame the interview as chaotic, defensive, and full of misinformation, but the headlines lacked their usual bite. The audience had seen what happened. The raw footage was already everywhere, impossible to reframe or spin. Meanwhile, alternative media figures, podcasters, and independent journalists hailed the moment as a turning point. Some called it the single biggest humiliation of mainstream media in recent history. Others compared it to historical interviews where the power dynamic had shifted in real time, where the person expected to be cornered had instead walked away stronger. Major YouTube commentators streamed live breakdowns of the interview, some racking up millions of views within hours. Reaction channels replayed Musk's most savage lines, pausing to let their audiences take in the sheer weight of the host's collapse. Even those who weren't necessarily Musk's supporters admitted the obvious. He hadn't just won the debate, he had dismantled the very foundation of how these interviews were supposed to work. And then Musk himself weighed in. No lengthy rebuttals, no defensive statements, just a single tweet. "The narrative is crumbling." Instantly, engagement skyrocketed. Thousands of replies, retweets, quote posts, some cheering him on, others fuming. But the impact was undeniable. He had controlled the conversation without saying another word. Back at the network, the damage control meetings had already begun. Producers scrambled to cut a version of the interview that softened the blow, but it was futile. The full, unedited footage was out in the wild, unstoppable, impossible to contain. They would issue statements, bring on experts to discredit Musk's arguments, try to reframe the discussion, but it wouldn't matter. The moment had already solidified in the public consciousness. The host, normally active on social media after big interviews, was conspicuously silent. No victory lap, no retweets of praise, no celebratory post-show breakdown. He knew there was nothing to celebrate. In the span of an hour, his reputation had shifted. He was no longer the unshakable interrogator, he was the man who had lost control of his own show. And in today's world, that was all people would remember.